last time that Southern Air Transport was in the news was during the Vietnam War, when it was owned by the CIA. Now it's a private company, but its competitors still call it the CIA's favorite airline. While based in Miami, Florida, Southern Air has recently been expanding its operations to the Bay Area. In a moment, we'll discuss Southern Air Transport and the CIA covert operations with the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, William Colby, in Washington, D.C., and in our studio, two Oakland City Council members, one who opposes Southern Air Transport's presence in Oakland and one who defends it. But first, this report on the airline, what it's doing in the Bay Area, and why some people want it out.
October 4th, 1986, Kelly Air Force Base, Texas. A large civilian cargo plane carrying explosives for the military crashes during takeoff. The pilot and his two-man crew are killed. The plane belongs to Southern Air Transport, a company once owned by the CIA. The next day, October 5th, an American plane is shot down over Nicaragua. The only survivor, Eugene Hasenfuss, is captured. The C-123 aircraft is loaded with weapons for the Contras. It's more bad news for Southern Air.
Sir, what was discovered after this C-123 was shot down? Was the plane identified with anyone in the United States?
Yes, unfortunately, the crew was carrying a number of identification cards, and the plane got identified with Southern Air Transport as being one of their aircraft. Mr. Cooper, as I recall, had an ID pass.
Southern Air denied the Hasenfuss plane was theirs, but finally admitted that they had purchased it for more than $300,000 on behalf of an unidentified third party. And that was just the beginning of their involvement. This man is a Southern Air pilot. He agreed to talk with us if we protected his identity.
It was general knowledge around Miami anyway that Southern Air was performing maintenance on these 123s that were flying into Nicaragua. The airplanes came back with bullet holes in them. They came back with tree bark and leaves under the wings, and it was generally known that Southern was doing the maintenance on them.
He told us that despite company denials, many of the Contra resupply flights were flown by Southern Air crews.
Some of those pilots are still flying with Southern Air and remained on the seniority list with Southern Air.
Colonel, would you stand up, please, and let me administer oath? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Congressional investigations have confirmed that Southern Air played a key role in transporting weapons to Iran, as well as secretly supplying the Contras. Those revelations sparked protests in the Bay Area.
On the other side of the street.
Demonstrators and Bay Area Congressman Pete Stark are calling for Southern Air's eviction from the Oakland airport, where Southern operates its West Coast maintenance facility. The Oakland operation is the hub of Southern Air's growing business in Northern California. Just 3 years ago, the Miami-based company had only 9 employees. Today, 600 people work for Southern Air, 30 of them in Oakland, and company revenues total more than $100 million. Southern Air operates the largest fleet of civilian Hercules transport planes in the world. The Hercs, like this one landing at Travis Air Force Base north of San Francisco, are the key to Southern Air's new prosperity. Hauling cargo for the U.S. Navy and Air Force will earn Southern Air $44 million this year. Southern Air also uses these planes to transport supplies and ammunition for the military to U.S. bases in Panama and Honduras. Not all Southern Air's business comes from the military and Ollie North, but one of their civilian operations has alienated San Francisco airport officials. It all started when Southern leased Boeing 707s to Burlington Northern, which started an Air Express business. San Francisco refused to let the 707s land here, saying they were too noisy and violated a state of California mandate to reduce noise at the San Francisco airport.
The FAA tells us if you continue to refuse landing rights to Burlington Northern and the Southern Air operation, we are going to withhold your federal grant money.
In the last 2 years, the FAA has withheld more than $17 million in federal grant money, funds which would have been used for safety improvements and runway repair.
The FAA administrator has unilaterally made a decision to withhold our money. We don't think that's fair or legal, that one person can make a decision to withhold $17 million from a public airport.
Do you have any suspicions, thoughts about government connections still with Southern Air that might have allowed them to get quick access to the FAA?
Well, it's crossed my mind, yes. It's crossed my mind that there may be some connection.
The FAA denies any favoritism in dealing with Southern Air, but the FAA did call off an investigation of Southern in Miami when Colonel North stepped in.
The FAA and Customs had arrived at Southern Air Transport and had said that they would like to look at the records, the maintenance records, and the financial records for Southern Air Transport. Mr. Langton called me and he said he didn't have any trouble passing that information to them. However, if they got into the accounting records, as they got into the account, they would come across other operations that Southern Air Transport had been supporting.
This is what Mr. Langton told you?
Yes, and that it may be that it would not be the desire of the people up here to have those operations exposed, and so possibly they should be made aware of that.
What did you do?
I called Colonel North, and I passed to him what Mr. Langton had said, and he said, call him back and tell him I will take care of it.
The protest against Southern Air's presence in Oakland has centered on Hangar 8.
This is Southern Air's facility at the Oakland airport. We arrived here this morning for a scheduled tour. But at the last minute, we were told that Bill Langton, president of Southern Air based in Miami, had said no cameras were to be allowed on Southern Air property. No further explanation was given. However, we were allowed to tour the facility without cameras, and as the manager pointed out, we saw no guns being loaded here, just a maintenance crew working on a Southern Air plane in from Travis Air Force Base.
We found no evidence that Southern Air was running guns out of Oakland. But this facility is absolutely crucial to maintaining all Southern Air's military and civilian flights, and Southern Air executives have lobbied hard against any local government moves to shut down this maintenance operation. In May, just before a crucial city council vote, Southern Air Vice President Charles Carson, in town from Miami, held a private breakfast meeting at the Oakland Hilton with several city councilmen and an aide to Mayor Lionel Wilson. Producer Ellen O'Leary caught up with Mr. Carson in the lobby.
I really have nothing further to say except I welcome your questions, okay? And we've got nothing to hide. We're a respectable airline, and we're very disturbed by the application.
Mel Wax, spokesman for the Port of Oakland, which runs the airport, insisted that Southern Air had broken no laws and need not be ashamed of its CIA history.
The CIA is on our side, after all, in theory, anyway. That's an American outfit.
Councilman Wilson Riles, Jr., a strong opponent of aid to the Contras, was not convinced by the Southern Air representatives.
They pushed very hard on the fact that they were providing so many jobs to our community, and because they were providing these jobs, then we ought to just leave them alone. Well, my response to that was, we've got a lot of drug dealers in Oakland that are also providing jobs for people and for our young people, and that's no justification for keeping those businesses here either.
But when Riles asked the Oakland City Council to adopt a resolution calling for Southern Air's eviction from the airport, he lost on a 6-2 vote. Just before that vote was cast, Southern Air President Bill Langton showed up unannounced.
Let me tell you what Southern Air Transport is not. We are not drug dealers, nor do we condone such activity. We are not arms merchants or gun runners.
That we place place in our bid proposals.
Curiously, the council did not probe Southern Air's business ties to South Africa, even though Oakland has one of the strongest South Africa divestment laws in the country. Southern Air leased 3 of its first Hercules transport planes from SAF Air, a South African freight company partly owned by the South African government.
The aircraft are still owned by South Africa. They're flown basically in the United States now on the military contracts and occasionally on the Japan Airlines contracts.
For some people, there's the impression that they're no longer owned by South Africa.
That impression is simply because they changed the numbers on the aircraft and the letter designation to a Southern Air designation rather than a South African designation.
The deal to lease the planes was made through Globe Air, a front company in New Jersey. Southern Air has played a strange and controversial role in Southern Africa. In Angola, Southern Air flew hundreds of flights for the Marxist Angolan government. We have learned that Southern Air was also flying supplies to anti-government rebels in Angola.
It was kind of an unusual thing that Southern was working for the Angolan government, the Marxist government, and at the same time apparently had some flights for the rebels for UNITA.
Another Southern Air pilot with extensive flying experience in Africa told us he personally had flown supplies to the Angolan rebels. Southern Air is currently under investigation by 3 congressional committees and 2 grand juries. But most of the 13 pilots we talked to have no regrets about the covert Contra supply operation, and they still express support for Ollie North. But some of the Southern Air employees we interviewed did say they were concerned about overwork, long hours, and potential safety problems.
He just came home unhappy with the way some of the things were going. In fact, it was just about a month before the accident that he said that they were going to kill somebody.
Mrs. Reber's husband, Charlie, was Southern Air's chief flight engineer on the West Coast. He and 4 other crew members were killed when their Southern Air training flight crashed at Travis Air Force Base. It was the 2nd fatal crash of a Southern Air cargo plane in 7 months. An investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board is still underway.
Probably one of his main concerns was that they didn't have enough crews, and they were working them too hard, too many hours. And there's only so many hours you're allowed to fly before you become illegal.
According to Mrs. Reber, her husband tried to alert Southern Air executives in Miami with a steady stream of memos, but was ignored.
He was upset because they wouldn't listen.
Southern Air has mushroomed in recent years. After Vietnam, business was slow, but Southern Air has prospered in Iran, Angola, and Central America as a sort of unofficial air force for the Reagan administration's covert operations. Competitors complain that Southern is still the CIA's favorite airline, given special treatment by the government and sought out for secret missions. Southern Air pilots have even made up their own mock spy decals.
There certainly was a connection with the CIA, and there may likely be a connection now. Most of the crews kind of hope there is some sort of connection with the CIA. Financially, it would help the company if there was some sort of connection.
The problem for Southern Air is that their cover's been blown. At least in the near future, they may be doing more testifying than covert flying.
We invited Southern Air Transport to be with us this evening. They declined. We invited them to be in the piece that you just saw. They also declined that. We do have with us William Colby, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He left that post in 1976. Mr. Colby, Southern Air's cover, as it is called, has been blown. Is it still a viable organization? Would you use it if you were on the job again?
I don't think its cover has been blown. I don't think it has any cover today. Its present situation is exactly the decision we made in 1970, I think, at 2 or so, that we should dispose of these airlines and not have any control over them anymore. And we sold them off. Remember, we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about the efforts that were made to bring arms to the Iranians, which I happen to disapprove of very violently, but nonetheless were approved by our president. And our president suggested that we go out and get these arms to the Iranians, and the people that were doing it, not CIA, or CIA only incidentally, the people who were doing it tried to use their own ways and then turned to CIA to help them, and CIA reached out for Southern Air Transport to help on the transport as an independent organization which was selling air services. Now, on the subject of the aid to the Contras, there's quite the contrary. The CIA had nothing to do with the Southern Air Transport involvement in that operation.
How do you know that?
By the testimony. The testimony that's come up and said that the General Secord and Colonel North arranged this by themselves, independently of CIA.
Now, Southern Air is a private operation. If the Boland Amendment says what we think it means, is Southern Air legitimate in flying those kind of missions into Central America?
The Boland Amendment said that no agency engaged in intelligence activities will give aid to the Contras. Now, that doesn't mean that a private organization can't do that.
Even if they're hired by the National Security Council or the advisor?
Now, then you get into a delicate legal question as to whether the National Security Council is under the same restraint as an agency engaged in intelligence operations. That's a debatable question. I happen to think that the government should not have done that. But the fact is that that's a close legal question.
Okay, the whole story of Southern Air Transport brings up once again this whole idea of the use of covert operations. And I wonder from your standpoint if you think in these cases that what's been going on is consistent with the ideals of the kind of an open democracy that we have in this country.
Well, I don't see anything improper about an open democracy of the United States helping people striving to create an open democracy in other countries. Now, I just don't happen to agree with the way that the Reagan administration has run the Contra operation. I think they got the paramilitary horse before the political cart. But in the situations such as Afghanistan, Cambodia, Angola, I think helping people to fight for what they believe in is a perfectly appropriate thing for the American government to do.
Jonathan Marshall is the editor of the op-ed page at the Oakland Tribune, co-author of a book on the Iran-Contra connection. You've been listening to Mr. Colby. Do you agree with what he says? Do you find any inconsistencies?
Well, I think the situation isn't quite as simple as he stated. With regard to Southern Air Transport and its relations to the U.S. government, for example, in 1976, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence reported on the sale of CIA proprietaries and noted that a number of those sales were conditioned on those companies, now private, doing future work for the CIA.
Proprietaries meaning companies like?
Meaning companies like Southern Air Transport. It did not specifically say whether or not Southern Air Transport had such an arrangement. However, the owner of Southern Air Transport is the former general counsel of that airline and other CIA proprietary airlines back in the 60s and early 70s. So at least the presumption would be that the airline may have had at least informal connections with the CIA afterward.
Informal connections as a potential customer, absolutely.
Why use that kind of a private company? Why not use an American Air Force plane?
Because there are some situations in which you don't want an American Air Force plane shot down. You would not want an American Air Force plane shot down over Nicaragua today.
What about the way that Southern Air actually operated? Do you think it was an efficient operation or a lousy operation?
I don't know enough about it. I can't comment on that. That really doesn't seem to me to be the main issue that we're talking about.
What is the main issue?
The main issue is whether the United States should be able to conduct covert operations.
Well,
and if it should, then should it be able to reach out to independent companies and hire them to help it do that?
Well, but another issue that ties in with all of that, which we can talk about here now, is what happens in a local community like Oakland. Wilson Riles Jr., who's a member of the Oakland City Council, is here. What has happened in Oakland? Something has happened. They're operating out of Oakland, and you don't like it. Why?
They're operating out of Oakland, and I don't like it for the same reason that I don't like Oakland to be involved with companies that are doing business in South Africa. Besides doing business with South Africa, Southern Air Transport is also, and has been in the past, involved in illegal operations. It's not just a question as to whether it's a covert operation or not, but we're talking about a covert operation which was involved in lying to the United States Congress about what they were doing to avoid United States law.
I believe there's no evidence. I believe there's no evidence at the moment that Southern Air Transport lied to the United States Congress.
The operation that they were involved in clearly lied to the United States Congress from the testimony that we have heard so far.
I beg your pardon.
Hearings.
There is an indication that the Assistant Secretary of State may not have told the Congress the truth. That's true. There's no indication that Southern Air Transport told any lies.
Okay, Leo Bizzell is another Oakland City Councilman, and you've been defending the right of Southern Air Transport to operate out of Oakland. What do you say to Councilman Riles' allegations?
I am not defending their right to operate out of, this whole issue is something that is of absolute no concern to the City Council. The issue was brought to us and placed on the table that we should suspend this organization in some way from operating out of our airport. Without proof of the allegations, we have chosen not to do that.
Assume that there are some illegalities, just hypothetically, that all the things that Wilson Riles says are true.
Yes.
Do you have a right at that point to kick them out or to make life tough for them?
Sure. I think that if the allegations had been brought to us that they were involved in doing business in South Africa, that issue was not brought to us. I'm hearing it for the first time. At the time that the measure was put on the floor before us, there was no mention of South Africa. We have a clear policy in our city against doing business with organizations that are engaged in business in South Africa.
Southern Air Transport has a long history, and clearly, as you indicated, it starts back in the Vietnam era with their involvement with the CIA. The CIA at that time involved in doing not only arms running, but also drug smuggling.
I beg your pardon. I deny that absolutely, and I have
you've denied it before.
But and I have a congressional. I have a congressional investigation to support me.
This is my point: is that this can go on and on in terms of allegations made back and forth for every little allegation that somebody makes. We, as a city council, are not equipped to deal with this. There are 3 congressional committees, 2 grand juries that are investigating Southern Air. Until we get something definitive from some official organ of the United States government, we are not going to debate this issue locally.
We have to understand what we are talking about here. We are talking about CIA. We are talking about a secretive organization. We're talking about a private company that works for them, where a majority of their funds come from them. We're talking about connections within the Justice Department, and we're talking about investigations that have been halted of them because of their involvement with the CIA.
All of these are legitimate organs of the United States government, are governed by the laws made by the Congress of the United States, and if any laws have been violated, I'm sure that the Congress will determine that. What I'm saying is that I'm more concerned about what is happening in East Oakland than I am about what is happening in Washington, D.C.
The CIA is obviously involved. Recent stories seem to indicate that the administration is now rallying behind the view that former CIA Director Casey was the orchestrator of this effort by Poindexter and North and the other officials of the federal government to subvert at least the intent, if not the absolute letter of the Boland Amendment by shipping arms to the Contras in Nicaragua. I think even Mr. Bazil is aware of that fact. And the question is,
and I don't necessarily go for it, but what does that have to do with us making policy about Southern Air?
Let's get back to the national issue.
If you want to get to Ronald Reagan's policies, we'll talk about it, and I'll probably agree with you on most of the things you're talking about.
Let's talk about some of those policies in the few minutes we have left. Mr. Colby, the name of William Casey was brought up. How much involvement do you think Mr. Casey had with Oliver North in the kind of things we've been talking about this evening?
Well, obviously, Mr. Casey had a lot of contact with Mr. Colonel North. I think on the question of shipping arms to the Iranians, he was heavily involved. In fact, there was a presidential finding that justified what he was doing. Now, with respect to the operations for the Contras, the skimming off of the funds and the passing of the money to the Contras, there was no finding of that. I think you will find that CIA had a very marginal contact with that, for one reason, because CIA was barred by the Boland Amendment from being involved with the Contras. If you want my opinion, frankly, if you're going to run a delicate, difficult, clandestine operation, you better use some professionals, not a bunch of zealot amateurs. The fact is that the CIA would not have lost a certain amount of money in Swiss bank accounts. We know exactly how to handle Swiss bank accounts so that the money doesn't go astray.
Mr. Colby, one final question, and that is, do you think that all the publicity surrounding the Iran-Contra Gate affair and even the Southern Air Transport situation is for the good in some respects, that people have learned more about all this?
Well, I think that the fact is, if you use the word CIA, you get an enormous amount of media hype. And that's the problem we have today. We're denouncing the SAT because it was once owned by the CIA. That happens to be almost 20 years ago.
We're denouncing it because it's taking part in a criminal war against the people of Nicaragua.
You've said it now. Could you sit down now?
Whether it's legal or not, whether the CIA is doing it or the NSC is doing it. It's a crime against humanity. 10,000 people killed by these mercenaries paid by the United States.
There goes your credit.
A little bit of prognostication before we totally end this. What's going to happen with SAT, Southern Air Transport in Oakland? Is it a dead issue or is it going to come back?
I think that there will be continued demonstrations. I think it will have to come back to the council at some point because of that. We'll have to deal with that question. I think more information will come out in the hearings, which will force us
Leo?
to...
And when that time comes and Mr. Wiles presents his evidence, I'll listen to him as I do on every issue and give him my vote depending on how meritorious he is.
Okay, Mr. Colby, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank
you.
Mr.
Bazil and Mr. Riles also, and to our studio audience.
Yesterday, Southern Air's lawyer, David Kirstein, did reply to questions we had submitted 2 weeks ago. Mr. Kirstein denied that Southern Air had ever flown supplies to the rebels in Angola, and he insisted that the airline is operating safely. He also acknowledged that a Southern Air Hercules had been used by the Oliver North operation to make an emergency airdrop of weapons to the Contras inside Nicaragua in April 1986. Something Southern Air officials have previously denied. He also revealed that Southern Air pilots had volunteered and flown arms to Iran in Israeli planes. Up to now, Southern Air has acknowledged flying the Iranian weapons only as far as Israel.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and that is our show for tonight. Next week at 8 o'clock, Express presents a 1-hour special on the new...
You could see her lips form the word wind. She is bothered. It's blowing right into her face.